Hey everybody, want to make another video. This time want to talk about the fact that in Milwaukee they are changing the name of the Madison school. And the reason that they're removing Madison's name off the school is because he was a slave owner. And I hope that the people who made that decision don't turn around and read the Bible. I hope they don't go and eat a Caesar salad. I hope they don't go and watch Alexander. I hope they don't take pride and look at an Egyptian pyramid, because all of these things had some form of slavery in them in various ways. And what I want to say is this. Oftentimes, when you talk about tearing down statues and removing names, it highlights a really big issue, and that is a lack of nuance when describing a historical figure. And let me just talk about a historical figure that most people know and love, Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King Jr. was, in all respects, a powerful and an influential man. He was one of the leaders of the movement for civil rights. But you cannot help but understand that he was also a serial cheater. And so you can have a nuanced view where you could say to yourself, I appreciate the speeches that he said. He was a very great speech giver. I appreciate his oratory skills and his ability to lead a movement. But you could critique his personal character in private. And you would not be wrong to say that. Now, to pretend that his whole life should be described by his personal failings would be removing the fact that his greatest impact on our society had nothing to do with those personal failings. And that's where nuance comes from. Nuance comes from acknowledging reality, that every historical figure that we look at can have some negative and some positive. So you look at Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. But Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln-Douglas debates sometimes talked disparagingly about African Americans. That's what he did. But does that make him a bad person? No. Because when you look at the big part of his life, he was one of the greatest presidents that the United States has ever seen. He won the Civil War. He freed slaves. He did a lot of things. Now, some things he did that I don't know, right? He limited free speech. He really did that. And that was kind of terrifying in some ways. So here you have a man who is not all white, not all black. This is a man who has some good and some bad, as all historical figures do. You look at somebody like James Madison, brilliant legal mind, but he owned slaves. But do you think his owning slaves is the biggest impact that he had on society? Do you think the fact that he slept with slaves is the biggest impact he had on society? No, it's not. It is not. And so you had to look at his life in its totality. The same with Caesar. We all eat Caesar salads, but you can't deny the fact that the Roman government was premised on owning slaves. And so when you look at Julius Caesar, you can acknowledge him for the great orator that he was. You can acknowledge him for the great political figure he was. You can acknowledge him to being a great general. You can acknowledge him for being one of the influential leaders in Rome that eventually ushered in this great age of peace. Really, it was Caesar Augustus who reigned over that. But the point is that he forged a path for that. And you look at him and you could say he had some negatives. He was cheating around. He was doing all kind of stuff. He had a couple homosexual relationships. But he still, over the course of his life, you can look and say he was a great historical figure that we won't want to take down in every reference to him, when we can acknowledge the things that are good about him while also understanding the things that are negative about him. The same with Abraham. Abraham owned slaves. It's undeniable that he owned slaves. He had lots of people in servitude to him, but he still was a great man. Did he mistreat his slaves? I don't believe that he did. Because when you look at him and how he honored people that worked for him, it's against his character to mistreat slaves. But when you look at his life, you cannot deny the fact that at one point he did own slaves. The same with David. David had a lot of slaves. David had a lot of concubines. It is beyond our imagination to pretend that every concubine that he had was somebody that was perfectly willing to be in his harem. A lot of those people were sold to him. A lot of those people came through marriage contracts. And the point is that you can acknowledge the greatness of David, but still understand the terrible decision that he had when he killed one of his top men, and he took his wife, Bathsheba. And still, you can acknowledge the Bathsheba incident. You can acknowledge the harem as a flaw. You can acknowledge all those things, but still see him as a great biblical figure. Why is it that we can acknowledge all these things and we can look at this reality, but when we look at somebody like James Madison, we cannot acknowledge the nuance? And I'll tell you why. It is because there's a movement in our country to remove the pride that we have for our founding and to pretend that it is nothing great about this country. And this goes back to the last video I just said about gratitude. There is a movement in our country to remove gratitude for our founding, to pretend there was nothing good about the fact that we were formed by people who made mistakes, who were not perfect, but still created a great system of government. We're going to pretend that all of that doesn't matter because they made some personal mistakes. They did some grievous mistakes. They ruined and harmed big groups of people. And I understand that. You can acknowledge that. But you can also acknowledge that while also acknowledging the good that they did. And that's the problem with a lot of people. You guys, a lot of these social justice warriors cannot see any shade of nuance. And so you guys need to open your eyes and accept the full totality of somebody's character. That one day somebody could be a mean person, but they could still do some good for you in business. Sometimes somebody could be nice and still be bad at their job. There is more complexity than just one facet of any person's character.